In the New York City public service system, the government is run by two unique but equally vital groups: the elected and appointed officials who design initiatives, and the employees tasked with implementing them. These are their stories. Dun dun! All right, well, welcome back to Civil Conversations, everyone. I'm Liz, and I'm joined by two amazing colleagues, former co-workers, because I no longer work for the city, just outstanding individuals that I've invited to talk with me today about the staffing crisis in New York City. And before I go into that, I just want to do a brief introduction. I'm joined by two team members that I have worked with over the years that, again, this concept of civil conversations has come from just chats that we'd have around the office at happy hours in our off time, sometimes like on trips to the restroom, whatever, like, did you hear about this? Just trying to get perspectives and to sort of vent to each other about happenings in our day-to-day and working in city government. And so these are two people who I have had extensive conversations with in all types of venues over the years. And so I'm so happy to welcome them to the show. First, I want to introduce someone who will go by Anthony today. So someone I've worked with across multiple agencies in my years that I worked for city government, has experience working in criminal justice, criminal reform, was an educator working in classrooms, has worked in nonprofit, in program assessment, program evaluation, and operations, and is someone that has a vast array of experience and just down-to-earth, awesome human being. So Anthony, welcome today. Thank you for joining.
Liz, thank you for having me. It's wonderful being here.
Of course. And then I'm going to welcome another colleague, former colleague, who will go by Sahara today. And she is someone who I worked with for multiple years. Again, someone who has experience in a variety of things, working for nonprofit, working in the DEI, social justice space, working in program evaluation, program assessment, operations. Both of these folks have worked in a variety of ways, which I'll go into a second. But Sahara is just an incredible person, someone I worked with and had a lot of deep conversations about culture and trying to create enriching workspaces, because we're both big people that believe in, feeling like we're invested in, like we want to have positive work culture, positive work environments. And so definitely excited to have her join me today. And thank you for being on as well.
Thanks, Liz. Appreciate it.
Of course, of course. Now, both of these folks I've worked with, again, in an operations capacity. I sort of ended my career in city government working in operations. Both of these folks not only have extensive backgrounds, but also have like a lot of practical experience in things like hiring, things like budgeting, things like contracting, team management, actual management, assessing quality. And so just in that wide array of experience that you have, not only like living through the staffing crisis, but also being a manager, a person involved in the hiring, a person involved in sort of all the intimate moving pieces. Definitely, I'm just like super honored and grateful to have you both here, because you really have a lot of that experience. And so thank you again. Just to give you all context on what we're talking about today is this New York City staffing crisis. It's gotten a lot of coverage in the last week. It started, I feel like, with this 5 borough report that came out and has sort of prompted more articles, more sort of reports to come out from the New York City Comptroller, Brad Lander, from the State Comptroller, Tom DiNapoli, from the City Council, from the New York Times had an article about it this week, the Daily News, City and State New York, Adrienne Adams, the City Council speaker, brought it up in her State of the City address. And then the New York Post also had coverage about it, because they're saying that the NYPD is, and the one of the union heads is saying, we're in a staffing emergency, that, police are resigning at alarming rates at a 117% increase from 2021. And so we are hearing a lot about the New York City staffing crisis, but to us, it's nothing new. For those that have been working in city government for the past couple of years, and for those that remain, this isn't news. It's nice to hear it coming up, but it's nothing that's like a novel idea. It's not sort of news. So I do want to sort of talk about that experience from a perspective of those working in city government, because there's more color to these stories, right? There's like the data and it's the impact that it's having, but it's also to like what's happening to these people who are working in these positions and what's the longer term impact, right? What are the sort of like fill in the blank things that we're not seeing? So just to also give, just as I was reflecting on this, and you guys can sort of chime in and give your
Yeah.
reactions too, please feel free. But I was thinking about these past couple of years. This staffing crisis for sure is not unique to the Adams administration. This existed under de Blasio, but I think it was sort of like two different dynamics. Under the de Blasio administration, there was sort of like this charge to cut spending because of COVID. COVID was the primary place to spend money. So there was definitely a bit of frugality when it came to assessing whether positions should move forward, because the city was trying to assess, do we allocate resources to COVID or do we, bring in people, which is like an ongoing expense. So I think that was sort of the nature of it in the de Blasio administration, because we were like at the peak of the pandemic. And then in the Adams administration, it was this, I think, sort of a push at first to like assess where we were in city government, but then this very quick turn to like address efficiency and cut headcount.
Mhm.
And so
Mhm.
over the course of a couple of years, we've seen like a tighter grip on hiring, and then somewhat of a shift of like pushing people out, right? Also conflated by a national issue with like people with COVID and the Great Resignation assessing. I fell into that as well. Like, what the hell am I doing with my life? Is this what I need to be doing? Should I be doing something else? Can I find more flexibility? Can I,
Yeah.
be making more money? You have families, costs all around us have been going up. And so there's so many factors that have gone into it, but certainly something that is not a new issue within the last few months. This is an issue that has been going on for a couple of years. And I think that we as people working in it, at first it started with like a happy hour here and then, like, the administration was changing. It was like, hey, this person's leaving. And then the happy hours became more frequent. And I was like, I think I might need a GoFundMe page to fund all these happy hours because I'm going to be broke. And then slowly but surely, it sort of became a competition, not a competition, but like sort of like a running joke, like, oh, it's
Yeah.
Friday. Who are we going to hear is
Who's-
leaving
Maybe.
next?
Absolutely. But and what's funny, Liz, I mean, you and I have been around long enough that we were here for the Bloomberg de Blasio transition. And even then, it was similar conversations, and you felt as though we just had to wait to see that first year how things panned out, and that things would eventually reach like an equilibrium of like, okay, now we know what the administration's agenda is and how we're going to move forward, and then we would adjust
Yep.
to serve the families and the people of the city.
Yep.
I think initially when the new administration came in, there was that same sense of, okay, let's see like the first 6 months what the transition's looking like, and the agendas and the policies of the new administration. We're over a year into it, and I still feel like we don't know what the vision and the agenda for this administration is. And I think that's really what disillusioned a lot of folks that were in city government and prompted them to leave when they otherwise might have stayed.
Yeah.
And I think that's the big difference between past administrations and this administration. And that's what I've been seeing.
Yeah. I think that's so great because I had not had that experience of changing administrations. This was my, when I was working in city government, it was my first stint in city government. And so that handoff was so messy. And going through that after coming from a space where you've seen it flow. And like, Liz talked about, COVID and how decisions were made around COVID, but that was an emergency, right? That was like all hands on deck. We need to figure this out. It was a national, global crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And then we kept that mindset into the future, right? We kept that like
Yeah.
scarcity mindset that like, oh my gosh, are we even going to have PPE? Are we even going to have like, a nurse to be there for a loved one? We just kept that mindset continuing. And that, I think, was what you talked about. That's the disconnect where that doesn't have to be, right? Like, what is the vision now? We're not in a scarcity mindset. Like, we're back to quote unquote normal, right? So why aren't we having more conversations about that? Why are conversations still in this space where it's like do or die? Like we're trying to move past that. And so you hit a great point about like there was no communication. And as a person going through an administration change for the first time, like no idea what's happening. And I'm looking to my leaders to guide me. Like, what is the recruitment space? What is the resourcing in the industry look like? And there was no guidance.
Mm-hmm. And I also want to call out somewhat of like, I feel is a shift over time with the departure of staff. and you guys let me know if you feel the same thing, but it felt like at first it was, to your point, Anthony, of like, we're changing administrations. We, at least my experience, and for many others who've been in city government much longer, you have changes and transition at the top levels, right? So like deputy chancellors, deputy commissioners, assistant commissioners, like depending on the structure of your agency. But it never really affected people sort of like in the lower parts, right? Like teams might be structured, initiatives might be tweaked and changed, but like that vision and that sort of execution came with time. And in this instance, it felt like it affected everyone. Like no one was sort of exempt from it, at least my experience in the agency. And over time, I feel like it went from people departing because they knew a change was coming and they sort of had to position themselves, or it was like, they found a more lucrative position because of the world of like hybrid work, remote work. They had just left to like find something with more flexibility or making a little more money, to all these people are leaving. And now we have all these vacancies, no one taking on that work. And then it became this sort of like silent departures, like going from happy hours to joint happy hours to people leaving quietly because they were just like so pissed off, so disillusioned, so happy to just be done and out, that like even the fervor and the sort of trajectory of what departures look like just changed so much over time. And more was just like, there's 6 people leaving, now they left. And then, it's just like you're happy that they got out and then you're sad to stay behind, right? And that's just sort of like how things have transpired and changed, which is just really sad to think about.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, you definitely see that with the changes in administrations, that it's usually like, as you mentioned, the higher level folks. For lack of a better term, the non-union workers are usually ones that are impacted by a change in administration, because they're usually appointed by the mayor's office.
Mhm.
But the middle managers and regular staff are by and large usually not impacted by that. I like to think of it like, if you have a car, usually when the administration changes over, you're doing like work to the body of the car, like the cosmetic stuff. But the engine, which is the regular folks that work in these agencies, that usually doesn't change by and large. And I think what we've seen from this administration, and the changeover, is that it's really impacting the regular employees and the middle managers. You're having a lot of them leave in large numbers, as the report is pointing out. And I think it's having an impact on these agencies that normally you wouldn't see, because the changeover and people leaving isn't something that's new. You do have a
Mhm.
lot of the higher level folks leave, and they do take their institutional knowledge and their expertise with them. But by and large, you still have these managers and these employees that are at these agencies that have been doing this for a number of years, or bring their own experiences into it, and the work still moves along. Um, and I think, even though there is some chaos and some confusion when there is a changeover, uh, as I mentioned earlier, you're expecting sort of within the first year, everything's going to start hitting like its rhythm and its beats, and you're going to pick up on what the agenda moving forward is. But along with that, there is a sense of, as you mentioned, Liz, of feeling some sense of opportunity, and feeling like, hey,
Yeah.
there's a new administration, things might be different. The policies and the agendas are going to be different, and they may align more with what I'm doing. So it may be more mission driven for you as an employee,
Mhm.
but there may also be an opportunity, or at least the sense is that there may be an opportunity for growth and promotion,
Yeah.
right? And that doesn't always necessarily happen, but at least there is that. And being still in city government and seeing this transition, no one that I've seen on my team or that I've spoken with that's in city government ever got that sense of like, hey, this new administration's coming in. This is a good opportunity for me. Very few people
Mm.
have I
Mhm.
seen that from. So that's another like glaring, fact that I've been noticing.
Yeah. Yep. And I want to pick up on that car analogy. So I'll take it one step further. I feel like they come in, they change the paint and they put some stripes on it, but they did nothing to the inside. So the car's still running like shit. It's clanking on the inside. Like there's a
Yeah.
lot of pieces that we know we need to fix, but I'm going to paint the outside. I'm going to make the car look nice. I'm going to make it look pretty, but the interior is looking jacked up and I'm not addressing the like real, right, aspects and issues to make this car actually like run better instead of just like looking better. So I absolutely love that analogy. Thank you for giving that.
Yeah, I'm gonna take it a different way, because in
There you
my
go.
mind, in my experience, I was like, what car? I felt like we were being towed. I felt like there was a whole nother.
There you
I was
go.
like, we're all in this car and there's something that's happening.
Yes, you're right. You're right. I don't know if you remember, for those that saw the movie Waiting to Exhale, when Angela Bassett threw all the cars in there and lit it on fire. That is definitely, it
That's
totally
the
could be
vibe.
that moment. Oh, yes. So all that to say, it's been a doozy, again, speaking to people who have been in city government for a long time, it's not been something that they have experienced across multiple mayors, multiple administration changes, right? Like even within mayors, you can have new leadership that comes and goes, and you have those changes, and it's stuff that people have not seen or experienced before. So it really is a staffing crisis. Again, I'm happy that it's starting to get more attention. It does make me a little sad, because I do feel like there were a lot of people who were going through this who did try to flag this as a concern way earlier in the game by contacting elected officials, by contacting news outlets. And so we did get to this point, but it's just sad that things had to get to the state that they have gotten to. But it is, it is what it is.
I think if I can briefly, I want
Yeah.
to just chime in. So that I think the issue is the city's always been aware of this possibly being an issue, or something that was in the horizon, and I feel that they've always postponed it and put it off for a future administration, or hoping that it would never come to pass. Um, because if we're being frank, the city never really wanted its employees, or the ones that could go remote, never really wanted to open that door, right? They viewed it as opening Pandora's box, because if it worked out that city services by and large could continue to operate on some level akin to what it was pre-COVID, they knew that they couldn't put the genie back in the bottle, right?
Mhm.
Now, the report does highlight that some services did drop off because of COVID and folks working remotely. But it briefly does mention, and I think needs to be further highlighted, that they dropped off because the city wasn't prepared to transition its staff remotely, or its workforce remotely. If they would have had these things in place, much like some of the private sector companies already had and some private schools had, that when COVID hit, they transitioned far better uh, than New York City did and some other municipalities did across the country, because they were already prepped for this. I think we would have seen that the services would have actually stayed at a similar level, at least for those administrative staff that could do that work.
Sure.
Um, so I think that the city never really anticipated for that, and now we're at a head with that. They
Yeah.
they asked folks to come back to work in 2021 without a real plan in place, and you can't tell people after a year and a half or plus of,
Mhm.
hey, you were able to work from home, have more time with your loved ones, take care of, any personal matters without having to take days off and do certain things and still perform at a high level, to then just come back as if though nothing happened.
Hmm.
But the mayor and the city are not the only ones suffering through this. I think the country by and large, after COVID, try to go back to what things were pre-2020, and I think we
Yeah.
can't do that.
Yeah. So you transitioned us to this report. So for those that haven't seen it yet, I'll link it in the notes and on the website. But this is the Boro Institute. Seems like a newly developed, newly formed think tank, which I'm really excited about, because I feel like we need a lot of that sort of outside of the box, not attached to systems thinkers to try and push the city to do things in a little bit more of an innovative and responsive way. A couple of colleagues through LinkedIn and through texts who are following Civil Conversations. So grateful to you all for sharing this report with me. But it sort of covers the New York City staffing crisis, but I feel in a different way. I feel like we've heard about it in different spurts and different bouts of coverage, like once it started affecting SNAP programs, when it started affecting provider payments for early childhood. Like we heard about the impacts of it and I'd say like a little bit in like piecemeal fashion. I feel like this report sort of like pulls it all together. It's like, this is the snapshot. It's 20,000 people, which I'd say questioning that information, not that they don't have it right, but who gave it to them, and is that number actually correct? Because I think it's probably worse than that. But they highlight how many people have left city government, and have outlined the impacts for multiple agencies, some that I didn't even know about, right? And I think the other aspect, which I think is unique and I'm really grateful for, is the fact that they're calling attention to those issues. Like, it's not just the impact that it's having on services, which is very important, and it's not just the numbers, but it's like, these are the things that people are asking for. The city is like sort of not up to speed, right, with the rest of the workforce and offerings and options, and or like does need to be mindful of culture and how they recruit and how they retain people. And that, truth be told, for me, the biggest thing is people are worth retaining. You know, I think that there is a bit of a stigma in this administration that people in the agencies are the problem. And some people may be, right? That's to be said in any organization, but there are a lot of people who really care about their jobs and, you know, are just there. Like, they're not attached to the politics. They're there to do the work. And to your point, they might be open to doing different things and promotion and growth and trying different areas. And the system itself is just not designed to encourage people to do that. And so, you know, there's no assessment of, or I think, an acknowledgement of the value of people in city government. This, I think, was like the first that I saw of people and their institutional knowledge are worth keeping. And I just really
Say that again,
love that
Liz.
that
Say
was
that
called
again.
out.
Preach that
Yeah.
again, Liz.
Yeah. Like, it's,
People
you
worth
know,
keeping.
and it comes at a cost, right? It's not just the head count. It's just not the dollars you save, but now it's showing the impact. And then what do you have to do to get that knowledge back? It could be bringing in 2 people who have no one to train them because there's no one who knows how to do that work, right? It's so complex. But ultimately, for me, it's like that is a huge thing that has not been covered. Why the employees, not just the numbers of people leaving the services, but why is it important? Why are they important? Why do they matter? And why is it important to retain them? So that was definitely just like a nice thing to see in terms of like the divergence of this conversation and like trying to take it one step further. And so we're going to go deep into a couple of the concepts in this report. And again, I'll link it for others to take a peek, but I'd love to hear just a couple or a few key takeaways, and then we'll go into like some, I guess, subtopics that come up within the report that has a series of recommendations on how to sort of, it outlines the challenges that I think are part of the staffing crisis and the implications of it, and some recommendations. But I want to hear sort of like any 3 top takeaways or like higher level just reactions you've had so far. Sahara, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Yeah, I wanted to kind of raise the roof and sing your praises about that, because people are worth keeping. And I think that's something that institutions glance over because they have an institution, right? They have a structure and they're like, no, this is all I need. And people are going to keep coming into that. But the workforce is changing. And, you know, the ways that we're thinking about, and you mentioned this at the top, Liz, like the ways that we're thinking about our well-being, our purpose, our mission, you know, the ways that we want to show up in the workforce is shifting. And institutions are feeling the brunt of that because they're not shifting fast enough. And I think one of the things that I loved about, you know, you mentioned this report that it speaks to that a little bit. I think it could do a little bit better in bringing in the voice of lived experiences. So like, what are the people that are currently going through this or have gone through this? What did they feel? Like, how did this show up for them? And I think that is a space where they can do a little bit more. I think they have some references to, you know, thinking about the culture and thinking about how to retain more people around this like 360 review process, or around, you know, creating more opportunities for like hybrid work. But it's also just about the very people that are there, right? Like, what are the values that they bring to the workspace? How are they living those values? How does that align to the actual work? Because working for the city is mission driven work. Like, you care about the people, you're a public servant. Like, you know, I think that piece of why people are continuously attracted to go into city service and why that keeps them there is not thought about. I think the other big takeaway for me was, and I appreciated them going through into this, is like, there's a lot of kind of black box nature to the application process of getting into the city, to getting promoted, as Anthony mentioned earlier. Like, there's a lot of like, you know, you got to find the right person who knows the right little detail with the right link, and then you figure out how to get,
That's right.
you figure out how to get into the matrix. Like, that, I think they hit the nail on the head, right? Like, we need more transparency. Like, we're not only the workforce craves it, but the people that are in city also need that, right? Like, it shouldn't have to be go talk to the 7 people at DCAS to get to the right person who knows how to work your civil service title, right? Like, you need to have that. And if they really want to attract top talent, like the report mentions, there's no way that Gen Z, there's no way that the future generations that come in are going to expect anything less than that transparency. Like, give it to me straight. Like, what is it that I'm signing up for?
And you mentioned some of this, and then this goes to your previous point too, Anthony, of like the city and how staffing existed before, like the workplace over the years. I guess it's like a certain level of, so for those that caught previous episodes, I've been around civil service my whole life. My dad worked for the city. So, you know, in 86, when I was born, he was already a civil servant. So I've been around it my entire life. And when I worked for the city, I sort of grew up or came into it already knowing what it's like, right? You punch in, you punch out, there's no flex, right? Like some of the norms that existed, because that's what was, right? A city job was that. And so I sort of like, I'm still married to that because I can't break away from it. That's just the frame that I know, because that's all that I've been around my whole life. And it's also sort of what I worked in. So it's hard for me to break that understanding. But city work is different, and it's changing, and it's changed. So like, what can that look like is an interesting question to your point too. So yeah, Anthony, you tell me, but I just want to say like that came up for me, and just thinking about that, and to your point, Sahara, of like coming into city government, it's also just like these norms and these expectations that sort of play into that. But anyway, that's a sidebar. Anthony, what do you think of the report?
No, and
What were your takeaways?
I agree with many of the points that Sahara mentioned with the mission driven work and sort of, you know, taking that experience or that lived experience that employees and people that work in the city have had into the report. And definitely, you know, the thing that stood out for me, the two things were the chief retention officer and the chief recruitment officer. Um, they're great ideas, I think. But maybe the application or the design of them leaves something to be desired, because they're both mayoral positions. And I think if that were the case, and I may be getting ahead of this a bit, but what stood out to me, if that's going to be the case, then a lot of their work and the way that they view the recruitment and retention is going to be driven by the policy of whoever the mayor is at the time. And as we mentioned a bit earlier, the agenda and the priorities changed based on that. And I think that those positions should be divorced or removed from city politics. Maybe it should be a independent board that assigns them through city council, along with the mayor's input. But I think that they shouldn't be mayoral positions, because then their scope and their work are going to be pretty much determined by whoever the mayor is at the time. So those were the two things that stood out to me, on top of what Sahara mentioned as well. You know, I think the civil service process is a nightmare. I've been in city government on the administrative side for over 10 years now, but in other capacities, I've been in city government for, you know, overall 15 years, working in some capacity with the city. But prior to getting to the administrative side, even I wasn't fully aware of what the civil service exam system was like. And that was a bit daunting to pick up on it. And even now, as a city employee, as a civil servant, it still can be confusing, because there's different titles for different agencies, there's different levels for different titles, and it's somewhat opaque. It's not very clear in terms of, you know, what does this title do exactly, and you know, how do I take this title, and then what's the trajectory or the progression or the natural progression. I think we all know, if you're taking an exam in college or something, you know, that course or that exam is leading you to this degree. Right. And I think there's really no delineation when you're doing this for civil service. But then it's important, because aside from getting the job, the civil service title is the primary factor of how much you're going to be compensated for the work you're doing, or the promotion opportunities you're afforded. So I think, as the report mentioned, this process needs to be very, very clear and simple to understand and to engage with. I, for the most part, think that it needs to totally be revamped. As Liz, as you mentioned, I think, you mentioned your father when was working in city government since '86, and a lot of that mentality of like there's no flex, there's really, you know, no ability to work outside of the system or the constraints that were set. A lot of that came from the fiscal crisis that the city was in the '70s, right?
Mhm.
Where employees were stealing time or there was a fiscal cliff. And I think we never transitioned out of that.
Mhm.
And we're seeing that now that the city is very rigid in terms of how they manage their employees.
Sure.
And Sahara, you mentioned this, that Gen Z, millennials to a certain extent, uh, they're expecting something different.
Mhm.
You can't continue thinking that you're going to just attract high talent because, hey, we're a city job. And historically city jobs were high sought after jobs,
Yep.
and especially even if you weren't in a city job but you knew someone who was there, the thought was always like, oh great, like you get a great salary, it's a secure job, good pension. They were highly sought after jobs. And
Mhm.
I even had an experience at my previous agency where I had conversations with leadership about growth opportunities and sort of how to move along within the agency. And I was a bit dismayed by some of the responses. And in short, what they said to me is, hey, if you want to find opportunities elsewhere, you can, because, we're a city job. And when you leave, there'll be 500 people lining up behind you to take your
Yeah.
position. And that's
Mhm.
been the thought that, I mean,
Yeah.
the city government and city agencies have had that thought process for ages.
Yeah.
Right.
Private sectors to some extent, but I think private sector shifted much quicker than the the the
Yeah.
um the the, the public sector.
And there's trade-offs, I think, between working in private and public. Like I feel like private, you might have more room for movement, more room for salary and certain perks. But like being in the city, you see the trade-offs and you accept like, okay, my salary might not be at a private level, but I have great benefits, I have
Mhm.
job security, right? So there's like a trade-off that you accept. But I feel like now with the staffing crisis, it's like those benefits too. Not only are you competing with other people, but the salary is not competitive. You're trying to contemplate changing the benefit structure, which was a big thing that kept people and attracted people. Now
Mhm.
retirees are getting pushed into plans that they're really concerned are going to cost them more in the long run, not be beneficial to them, which if you worked for 20 years thinking this was a benefit, that could have been a big reason why
or
you
being
stayed.
or
To
they're
now
being moved
change it, it's just like taking the rug out from under people.
Yeah, or they're being moved to Medicare, right? When
Yeah.
they all their lives or their working careers, they paid into this premium plan. And
Yep.
now your union's telling you, hey, to cut costs, we're gonna switch you retirees who are on fixed income
Yep.
to Medicare, which it's great, but it wasn't what they signed up for, what they were expecting.
Exactly. Exactly.
So and the other interesting part is that um, the job security and the pension were always driving factors to keep people around, aside from the mission driven work. If you're in
Mhm.
education, you're in there either because someone really impacted you as a young adult in education and you want to give back in that manner. Um, so there's that component. But then there was the pension. There was the fact that you're more than likely a union employed, which is, far and few between in this country now.
Mhm.
And there's
Mhm.
that sense of safety of like, hey, I'm in a union. My job for the most part is secure. But Liz, you and I know that's not always necessarily true. They can find ways to get
Mhm.
rid of you,
Mhm.
even if you're in a union, and they can make your life very difficult
In
to the
terms of
point.
like environment,
Yeah.
it's like some people who need to be gone don't get gone.
Exactly. But
Yeah.
there's people
Like some
there.
people need to be pushed
Yeah.
out. They're like
So
the
there,
bad eggs, right? Because you talked about theft of city time. And there are people, right? This is where
Yeah.
I get frustrated with city governments. Like there are some people who make certain stereotypes true, and there's some people who abuse. But my thing is like then take it out on that person. Don't create all this red tape that
Right.
then like messes things up for everyone else and creates this like toxic, crappy environment with like all these like with all this rigidity. Like punish the people who deserve to be punished for taking advantage. Don't punish everyone else.
Yeah. It's like they take a sledgehammer to an ant. Like they find,
Mhm.
like they have a problem in one space and they do the most widespread policy that solves for the worst case scenario across all boards, and it ends up actually hurting people. And I think also, like, you know, if you factor in diversity and communities that are marginalized, like that's where it's hitting the most, right? Like you're not only in terms of the service that we're providing to the residents of the city, but also like the workers that represent those diverse communities, like it ends up falling on them, right? Because they're either in the field or they're in these positions where they can't do X or Y. Like they can't have that mobility, they can't have that flexibility. They don't even know who to go to have a conversation about, you know, where's my next step.
Yep.
All of these policies that come down super hard come down even harder on them. And I think, you know, it goes into how the report talks a little bit about retention. I think retention, you have to really think about what the culture is in the space. Like one of the things that this administration has done really well is like create disillusionment. Like people don't know where to go for information and where to go to find out what's even happening. Where even these policies that they're coming in with, you know, to hire at the lowest base salary, like why? Like what is where are we actually driving that from? Like what is the actual financial like scarcity that we're experiencing? Why can't we be clear about that? And in my experience with the city agency that I worked with, like that was the biggest thing that bothered me, because it's like you're treating your staff, you know, as Anthony mentioned, not only as just like you're just a dime a dozen, you can get so many more, but you're belittling and insulting their intelligence and their you know what they bring to the workforce and what they bring to the agency. You know, they deserve to know why you're making the decisions you're making. We can handle the hard truth. Like, you know, we might be working with populations, you know, if we're in education, we might be working with 12-year-olds, but we can handle it. Like, you know, let us know what it is that you're going through. And if you have to make tough decisions, don't have this like air of, you know, we know what's best for you. It's super paternalistic, it's super oppressive, and it's insulting, frankly.
Yeah. And part of like that whole paying at the base, you know, and to your point, Anthony, too, about what city jobs have meant over the years, like for me personally, I can say it was like a path to what I guess was a middle working class back in the days, right? Like my parents both either just had high school education. My mom got her GED when she was like an adult, and we were already sort of like older. They had, you know, like hourly jobs for the most part, but having my dad's stable job for the city, once that time came, it was like a steady paycheck. You know, he worked for it. He could work for overtime, which meant like we can get things like a VHS of Beauty and the Beast was like a big deal because, you know, my dad had like a little money in his paycheck from overtime like that. That's a way of like giving better opportunities to people. And sort of where I get frustrated, to your point of like, what's the point here is, okay, you're kind of like lowballing people to talk about decreasing the amount of costs for staffing. But at the end of the day, most of these people are city residents, and the costs around us, like rent has gone up ridiculously. Like people in my building talking about 20% increases on their rents, you know, like, and then you have eggs that are $8 a dozen for store brand and milk, which is ridiculous, and butter is ridiculous. Like you go to the store, you could get a few things, even just fruit, eggs, and bread, and that could cost you $20. Like it's insane. So, you know, it's also a disadvantage to the city because you're sort of crippling how much people can spend, their ability to keep roofs over their heads, and to have things that give them like a good quality of life and like opportunities for their families. So it's also, again, like, what is this going towards? And at the end of the day, these are people who are financial contributors to your city and people who will, you know, like you're investing also in future generations, arguably so, because if your staff do well, their kids can do well. If they stay in the city and they like work, you know, living in the city and seeing what it's like to work in the city, they'll stay. So it's, again, like it seems to me, I agree, like very short-sighted and not lacking a sort of like comprehensive strategic vision. And that really sucks.
It's like, as one of the folks or people that they polled in the report says, like a sort of like a death spiral, right? Because you know, you're talking about on one hand bringing on top talent, but then you're offering them the lower pay in a pay range. You're not going to attract top talent that way. And my experience recently has been that we at our agency have had a difficult time bringing on people to certain key positions because we're offering them the lower end of the pay spectrum. So they're just flat out turning it down because most people already know that if they went to the private sector, they could do a similar job and make twice as much. So you're hoping to bring these people on because there is that mission driven work that they want to do and give back to their community and support, you know, support the city and give back in that way. but then you're telling them, hey, here's a pay range. We're gonna give you the lower end, which could be as much as $30,000 less in the top range. You're not going to attract people that way. And then if you do, my experience has also been you get people there, they don't stay very long. So now
Mm-hmm.
you're expending the resources and the capital to bring them on, onboard them, train them, and then you're losing them in 6 months or less than a year, and now they're leaving. You're still having this vacancy. They're going somewhere else in the private sector with the knowledge that you just gave them, and that company is now benefiting from that.
Right.
So that's a big issue. And then the folks that do stay, if you're offering them this lower pay range and you're not really being competitive with the salaries, they may stay, but now they're not really being contributors to the city, as you mentioned, Liz. They may stay and work for the city, but now they're living in New Jersey or they're moving out to Connecticut. And I've seen that happen a lot with current employees, but also new employees that we bring on. So, they're benefiting the city in one aspect because they are providing a service in whichever agency they're working at. But if they don't live here, now they're not giving back to the city because they're not paying city taxes. They're not shopping and patronizing local businesses. So then I think that has a negative impact on the city as well. And I don't think they think about that because, as you said, rents have gone up, the cost of food has gone up. They say that the inflation rate is 7-8%, but I doubt that. I think it's much higher than that, right? So
Yeah.
if you're not paying people to come on and paying them a livable wage based on the current circumstances, you're not going to attract top talent as they say in this report.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And like matter of fact, like it's exploitative. Like you're getting into a space where you're exploiting from people's either their information or their time. And then to your point, Anthony, like what about the people that went through that were at the city that hired this position, that did all this recruiting and sourcing? How much time did that take from their everyday, business as usual work? Then they bring somebody on board, they go through all this training, like you mentioned, and the person leaves. Now they have to do triple work. How does that make them feel? How does that make them want to contribute? So like,
Mm-hmm.
again, that cultural piece, like you're really thinking about what is this agency, expressing to the employees that are here and to the employees that come and then leave. Like that culture piece is really oftentimes, that what makes people stay or leave. Like, there's articles about having a work best friend like is necessary. It keeps you motivated, engaged, and keeps you productive in your job. Like those basic facets of like what it is about human motivation in the workplace feels like is lost completely, right? Like on this, we're so hyper focused on structure over structuring policies to make people come in and to make them stay, as opposed to thinking about, okay, what is actually happening at these agencies and how are people behaving with each other? How are they actually showing up? Is there a sense of security? Do people feel psychologically safe, right? Like we've had 2 years of, 3 years of the pandemic. Now we've gone through this fiscal crisis. We're still in a recession. This shows up in people's everyday. There's trauma like that shows up in people's everyday. And I recall like when we came back to the offices, our return to office, there was unfortunately people that had passed away from the day that we
Yeah.
left to the day that we came back that were our team members. And there was no sort of collective mourning. People did things on their own on the side, but there was no acknowledgement even of, at least in my agency, of like what had happened. It was like, okay, go, like here's how you need to come back, here's how you need to give, and we believe in you, and like all those like performative phrases. But there wasn't even acknowledgement of like, here are the people that I work with and here's how this has impacted them. And I think that is really, a space where there's report can go into a little bit more, but it is what is going to affect retention. It's what's going to affect recruitment, because if I'm coming back to a city job and I'm meeting with Anthony, that shows on his face, right? That's going to show up in the way that you
Yeah.
speak about the role in the company
Oh,
and the
yeah.
agency, and it's going to impact me.
Yeah. I remember once many years ago, I went to an interview. I was part of the Urban Fellows program, and you interview at a series of different agencies. Like they require you to interview with at least 12 different teams. And I remember going into an interview and the office was dead. No one was talking to each other. The
Mhm.
boss looked miserable. And I was like, there is no way in hell
No,
I'm coming
hard
to spend my
pass.
time here. Exactly. Because it just looked like everyone hated each other. There was like no camaraderie, no energy. It just looked like that's where places like where souls go to die. And I was like, there's no way that I'm coming to work here. So it absolutely shows up. It absolutely shows up. So I do want to talk a bit about the challenges in the report that they talk about, and then they sort of go into the recruitment and the retention and some of their recommendations. So I know we started touching on that, and I know there's like more to go into, but I sort of want to go back to the staffing crisis at a basic level. So we have, 20,000 people who have left city agencies. And they go into somewhat of like an analysis on the challenges that have left to people departing city government. And this had come up before. And to me, I sort of like just want to talk about what you think is missing in terms of the challenges that were identified and like what sort of exacerbated, right? This like massive flight from city agencies, which we've definitely gotten into, but I definitely just want to have like target and zone in on that a
Mhm.
little bit and then
Yeah.
sort of shift over to right the implications that we're seeing that have now in services and then the recommendations that they make in the report. So one thing that you both spoke about, and it's something that I wish sort of was more present, is this, you have a city job, be happy with it, you have to expect that this is, or accept that this is the way things are. And as a city worker, I feel like you're not entitled to have nice things. You're not entitled to be treated like with anything. Like you can't get breakfast when you have a meeting. They can't treat you to lunch. Like there's no niceties when it comes to working in city government. There's no reward for going above and beyond. Like it's just like lots of challenges and this sort of like thing over time that has sort of developed that this is just how things are in city government, and you're not entitled to have anything nice, whether it's like your workspace, whether it's sort of acknowledgement opportunities and ways to recognize people for their hard work. It's sort of like you do the work, you have a job, that is the benefit, but there's like no bells and whistles, and that's just like something to accept. And so I feel like that has definitely gotten tighter over the years. Like one thing I'll give de Blasio credit for is that I felt like during the administration, there was a bit of intention put on building workplace culture and providing resources for employees. It wasn't many. I'm talking basic stuff like having like Weight Watchers at work, and we had work well competitions where we had like step competitions, and you got like a water bottle if you reached a certain step goal, and it caused people to like rally with their teams and go out for lunch and get to engage in different ways. It promoted healthy behavior, promoted like more mental health, and just like opportunities for people to even do things after work. Like they'd host mixers down at 1 Center Street, at DCAS, like stuff like that. So I think build up a little bit more value in different generations. Like they had, 30s and under come mix and mingle with people, like just some more of that, just interaction that I feel like after January, it was just gone. You don't get those emails anymore. Those types of staff initiatives were just like chopped. And it's not, I don't think that they were exorbitant. I feel like we've always in city government known to get by, to do more with less. But it did go a long way in terms of like building up a certain culture. So I feel like that also was something that contributed to your point, right? Culture, the environment that has beyond the numbers and competing with like the external sort of factors of like the post-COVID world and the workforce and all that, is just the culture and the environment shift. And so I wanted to talk to you guys about your experiences. Like what has the staffing crisis sort of behind the scenes look like? And what are the other factors really like not captured here that have affected people's decisions to leave? And what are the implications for that, right? Like we're already seeing the impacts to services. This is just a year and change in. What's that going to look like in a few more years? And so just curious to hear your thoughts. Anthony, I don't know if you want to go first since we started with Sahara last time.
Yeah, thank you. And I think all of the points you brought up were super valid. And I think uh, I've always felt being in city government that we're like the MacGyvers of the workforce. They tell us like here's a piece of tape and a string and make magic happen, right? And
Yeah.
provide
Love
services.
that.
Yeah.
So I, and I and in many aspects that is true. But now I feel as though that piece of tape's been removed and we're just given the string, and it's like now still make magic happen. Um, a lot of what the report highlighted regarding the staffing crisis It's true and it's valid. You're seeing some of this happen
Mhm.
because of the shifting dynamic and the workforce and what we value as a workforce, right? But there is the mandate from City Hall, and the report does briefly mention it of only hiring, first there was the hiring freeze for fiscal issues, just to sort of gauge it. And I think that that was valid and was reasonable to do, especially during the height of COVID. But once we returned back to the offices, the hiring freeze still persisted. Then it was a 3-to-1, 2-to-1, and we're still pretty much in a 2-to-1. And even when we're trying to bring on positions that we flag as valuable positions or high need positions, we still have to go through all of the bureaucracy and the red tape of getting OMB approval. Your chief executive or someone in the agency has to sign off on that, and that causes delays in that. And we can then get that rejected on the back end, right? Because something that that the report did mention is uh, figuring out how to retain high valued employees, right? Um, and it goes both ways. We can figure out how to retain high value employees and how to bring them on. But what we in our agency may view as a high value position or employee may not necessarily gel with what City Hall and the
Sure,
mayor's office views as a high valued position.
sure.
And I think that always stuck out to me that, um, the retention or the recruitment officer, again, being a mayoral position, is somewhat detrimental to the different agencies because I think these positions need to be at an agency level, and maybe again being an independent panel, but with agency level representatives. Because if you're in the Department of Health and the Department of Education, what you value as a high value position is vastly different than what the other agency does values as a high value position. So I think that's something that we've been seeing where we're trying to bring on these positions and we're just getting rejected for them
Mhm.
because they're saying you don't need the position, and also they're noticing that we are doing more with less, right?
Mhm.
And in my shop, I've there's been 4 people that have left in the past year, all of them taking their institutional knowledge with them, their expertise, their ability to improve the culture and in the office. So there's that void there. And the rest of us that have stayed behind, for lack of a better term, have tried to fill the void as best we can. And that includes the work, um, continuing to move it forward, but also learning some of the things that they left behind, and then also trying to fill that cultural void that they left.
Mhm.
And at the same time, we're trying to now bring people on to replace these individuals. And in many cases, we're being told, hey, that's not really a high value position. We're not approving you to hire for that position. And also you're sort of making do with what you have now.
Right.
So I think that's something that I've been seeing a lot of, and my colleagues as well and other divisions are experiencing that as well.
And I wonder sometimes, like just having seen that myself, I don't wonder, I think
Mhm.
just based on my personal experience that people never really took time in the transition to understand what people were doing. So it was sort of this directive to get by with less, with thinking that people could just take on the work of 3 individuals and sort of keep things moving, not understanding what the implication would be for making such sort of mandates, to say, okay, 3 people can do the job of one, but do you understand what those other 2 people did? Do you understand when you remove them, what holes are left? Because it's one thing to say to learn that job, but again, there's institutional knowledge and experience and skill sets, truthfully, that can go out the door that you can't assume the next person can sort of like pick up, which is where at least in my experience over the last year and change, was like, actually, I didn't make it in the last year. I didn't make it that far in, but in the time that I was there, it was definitely the expectation, like, the football was dropped, you pick it up and you run with it. But it's like, I don't even know how to play football. Like, which direction am I going? Like, I've never, it's so like such a variety of things that come into play. And it's this misunderstanding, exactly like totally agree that there's this, you don't need that position. That's not a high priority position, but it's like, you don't know my work to understand that it's a high priority position. And then just looking at all these challenges to see that have come up now, it's like you, I guess, kind of hope that things wouldn't come to a head. And now they are. And people are starting to pay attention to all these sort of mandates and services that aren't happening because you chinsed and didn't, also plan. I'll share a personal experience, like part of my transition, which was incredibly frustrating with people leaving. And then even just myself, I never wanted to leave the people behind in a bad position. And I tried to be very intentional about my transition, like outlining everything that I did, links to things, where I thought work could sort of like be reassigned or where things needed assistance. Like there's only so much I can ask people to do. And this area really needs attention. And there were no conversations about that. When people left, it was like they left and then they dealt with it afterwards. And more often it was, they'll figure it out amongst themselves. I'm not getting involved. And then that just got incredibly messy. And, it's a very awkward and awful position to be put in, that you're being tasked with doing something that you have no expertise in, that you don't get training in. And then at the end of the day, when things fall apart, it's your fault. But it's like no one prepared for these transitions. No one was strategizing about filling these vacancies and these voids of expertise and skill set. And then it's sort of like on me to pick it up. And then I'm also the scapegoat when things fall apart. It's like, what is, it's just that sort of like lack of foresight. And a lot of people just got frustrated by that dynamic and were like, you know what, I don't have to deal with this. I can go elsewhere. Because the reality is, when you work in city government, you work with a lot of people, and you can, have people who will vouch for your expertise, your skill set, your integrity. And I think that they sort of also thought that people were just going to stay and like take it, and that they didn't have alternative means or these ways to get other jobs. And the harsh reality hit that, yeah, I'm staying. And I think a lot of people were attached to the work that they were doing, but it's like, you know what, like, I don't have to take this. I don't have to take that. I'm going to use I have a potty mouth. Like, I don't have to take this shit. I'm taking myself elsewhere. Like, I can go someplace where I'm more valued, and I can take myself where I don't have to deal with this toxicity and this lack of direction and lack of mission. So I also think just like a lot of people got fed up with that. And Sahara, you mentioned this earlier. I, to this day, can still not figure out, and Anthony, you mentioned it too, like we're over a year into the administration. The FDNY, there's lots of coverage too about the shakeup happening at that agency. And I do think that there are some people who have gotten accustomed to how the systems worked, and they do need like shakeups every once in a while, or at least someone to tell them like, look, this isn't working. We need to be better. But what has happened in the FDNY recently, where like you've heard that the FDNY is falling apart, and like, are people dying and are things happening? Like, I actually feel like you don't hear much about that. If anything, it's the opposite of like heroism and people going above and beyond. So what are the challenges that you're trying to address, and what's the vision moving forward? And that has been a huge void, I think, in terms of leadership and management. It's your point of like communication. There has not been any. And so people just feel very disconnected because there's no direction, and there's no end goal. You haven't shared that with anyone. And this far in, I feel like it should be there. So I think a lot of people have just gotten very frustrated by that. And those that remain, it's probably even worse. Like, I can't even imagine what it's like right now.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to touch on what you just said, and then I want to talk about data. But I think, yes, 100 times to that. I think, we're also all adults. We understand politics. We understand, what it means to be a mayor, and the things that you're balancing and the things that you're driving. But there's also like the leadership behind that, right? Below that, right? So if a mayor has a particular platform or a particular way or a particular lobbying that's affecting him, fine. But what about the leaders that are below that, and then 2 rungs below that? How are they thinking about the workforce, right? Where are these chief of staffs that's part of your remit, right? Like, you're thinking about how to balance the mayor's priorities, and then how to balance the workforce and what's best for them. And there's huge gaps, I think, in those spaces where we don't really have a sense of that, what you said, Liz, right? Like that North Star, that like, what are we working towards? Like, okay, is this, are we in a financial crisis? So what does this mean how are we going to deal with that? What does that actually look like? Like communicate that to
Mhm.
people so that they know what to do and they can make choices. And it is, you know, I mentioned this before, it's insulting to people's livelihood and to what they bring to their work that you think that we can't, you know, is it that you think we can't handle that information
Yeah.
or that we won't be able to, you know, provide, you know, feedback or strategy? Like, I think that piece for me is what's frustrating. It's like, we know, we get it, like, right, we understand what mayors do, we get it, but everybody else outside of that really looks at the workforce and helping us manage that change, I think is not really showing up the way that we need them to. And then I wanted to talk about data because the report talks a little bit about like having these like reviews and exit interviews and, you know, being data driven. And I think very important, but I also think like actually listening to people when they bring you that data. And so my lived experience when I was working in the city was that we had data to show them like, hey, here's what's happening. Here's what's happening in programs. Here's what quality looks like. Here's what, you know, staffing looks like. And I had partners that worked across different agencies that had similar data that they could bring to leaders and say, here's what it would look like if XYZ thing happened. And that wasn't taken into consideration. It wasn't taken as, you know, either valid or, you know, important enough to even talk about. Our team, you know, when I worked for the city, had employee satisfaction or employee feedback surveys that we did within our team, like within our microcosm. And we listened to those. We listened when our staff told us like, hey, this isn't working, or I don't feel safe, or, you know, I need XYZ to feel more successful. We took their feedback, we listened to it. Even in the confines of bureaucracy, we tried to do what we could. And I think there was not only was there no understanding of like what is the value of listening, you know, data tells stories, like you need to actually be open to listen to that. And I don't think there was a value in using that to make decisions. It was, you know, again, we understand the game, like very much, you know, politics is at play, but there's also, you can really make data driven decisions if you take the time to sit and like actually meet with the people that are working with that data every day. And I think that was a big miss, to your point, Liz, that like there wasn't a consideration of how are things going, where are the pain points even, right? Like things that could have been, you know, a medium size of a problem became extra huge. It could have maintained medium size, right? Maybe you couldn't solve it in that, you know, 2 years, but you could have kept it at that level. And I think because of not considering the data that already existed, not getting new data and being open to listening to those stories, I think they really dropped the ball, and it shows, right? Even with these exit interviews, you know, when I left, I didn't have an opportunity. I sent out an email saying like, here's what happened to me, and I shared my voice in that way. But I didn't have an opportunity to have an exit interview until much later. You know, almost 6-7 months out of me leaving, I get a random email saying, "Hi, like here's an exit interview for the deal." And I'm like, I don't have time for this. Like, why would I, when you weren't there to listen to me, when I was actually going through something and I could provide you feedback, why would I now take time out of my life to provide you feedback that I know you probably won't even listen to? Because if you had, you would have listened to me when I was leaving.
Sure. Absolutely. So we've talked a lot about this recruitment. And so I do want to, again, so first, let me actually point out this though, right? So the report goes into a lot of the challenges that have sort of now culminated as a result of these vacancies and people leaving. And again, some of these were not surprising to me, but alarming in a way, like not surprising in that I knew that agencies were going through these shortages, but then seeing the impact and finally starting to hear some stories and people really understanding like tangible examples of why that this is actually a problem and like why it exists. So you have slowdown in affordable housing development, and someone had mentioned that a team of 6 that used to manage sort of these the tax credits to develop low-income housing shrank from 6 active employees to 1, requiring the agency to request a waiver to have a consultant come in to fill gaps. So you have a team of 6 going to a team of 1, and this could be affecting, okay, that housing program is how many buildings? how is that realistic that one person can manage that workload? Of course, that's going to fall apart. You have longer stays in shelters for homeless families, threats to early childcare and education. The Division of Early Childhood, which I left, has seen a decrease, I think they said, of 45% of people in their team. And that is absolutely accurate. It's absolutely true. You had delays in food assistance. We saw that in the newspapers with folks not getting their SNAP benefits, sometimes just getting rejections, probably just because they couldn't handle the workload. You have fewer resources, I feel, in general for legal support. So that goes from housing discrimination to representation, then processing cases. You have delays in addressing housing conditions, doing housing inspections. They have, issues with agency operations, increased risks and violence at Rikers Island. They showed during COVID they didn't have sufficient staffing and afterward to cover the just basic level of coverage that they needed in city jails. You have slowdowns in trash, you have people awaiting trial, you have pedestrian issues, safety issues, you have bus lanes, they have mandates and targets that they haven't been reaching. Last year, noticed this too, they didn't have enough lifeguards to open swimming pools. And just when I think of like all that we're experiencing with young people and young people committing violence, that to me should be a priority, that you have safe spaces. And not only can you hire those young people, but you can also create safe spaces for them to not be getting in trouble. So you have probably so many other ripple effects that aren't captured here. But, we have anecdotal that we hear from people and teams that are still behind. It's like, we have just slashed a lot of the things that we used to do because we don't have the staffing, or programs that we had, to your point, Sahara, that we did before, which seem to have had value, have just been cut completely. And so again, it's like, what is this sort of striving for? So again, that's like some of the impact that we're seeing. And the report has mentioned, some recommendations spanning from recruitment, retention, and modernizing government. Those are the three things that they sort of outline. And I do want to talk a bit more about recruitment specifically. So for people who don't know, most of you probably do, but the city is supposed to hire mainly through civil service exams. There are some positions that are appointed, some that are managerial, but by the most part, most of the workforce is hired through civil service exams managed through DCAS, which is the Department of Citywide Administrative Services. And it's interesting because that's the department, and we'll have to have a separate conversation about that for sure. But like DCAS does a wide variety of things, and somehow like hiring is like something that they do in addition to like managing fleets and supply contracts and facilities and all this. Somewhere just thrown in there is managing civil service. And to your point, Anthony, you mentioned of like this process of taking tests. I giggle and I tell people, it's like, first of all, they have crazy titles, like bananas titles. Like I saw puppeteer one year and I was like, you cannot be serious that you need to take a puppeteering test to work for the Parks Department. Like, crazy. And then you got to pay $80 and get on a list and then wait to be called on that list in order to be a puppeteer for Parks Department.
And
like,
non-refundable, by the way.
There you go.
Non-refundable. So you're paying $80.
Non-refundable.
It's a wish and a hope and a prayer that
Yep.
you're
5 years later you hear from someone.
That the test actually goes through, because they can cancel it at any time.
Yeah.
And you're not getting that money back. And then when you do take the test, you're hoping that you get added to the list, or you get called off of this list that gets generated. The scoring for these exams is a bit opaque. No one really knows what happens, in this dark room. So you're hoping you get ranked appropriately on this list, that it gets published or comes out, so that city agencies can then start calling you off of this list. Then as I mentioned earlier, there's the other thing of like, okay, I'm a puppeteer for the Parks Department, but what other agency takes this puppeteer license? Because there may be another agency that we don't know about. But it's also difficult to always figure out, like, okay, this civil service title applies to all of these agencies. So you can mentally prep yourself and say, all right, there's 5 or 6 agencies that take this civil service title. I have the ability to apply or look for jobs within those agencies. And that's not always clear as well.
Right. And we talk about the content of these tests. So I've taken probably 5 over the years. And one was an administrative manager test. And I remember taking that. And one of the questions is, you're a golf manager, you're a golf resort manager, and this is how much your resort or your whatever department is generated in this year. How can you project? I'm like, I don't fucking work for a golf resort. I have no idea what in the world this means. Like, I do nothing of that. And to me, it's also like you're administrative manager, sure, you're doing administrative tasks, but like you're also managing people. So sometimes like the questions are totally irrelevant to the work that you'd be doing and not applicable. But it's like, you have to take it, you have to get a good grade. There's no sort of guides to help you study them, because when you do get one, it's like on a type, like literally done on a typewriter from probably 20 years ago. And it's not reflective of what you ultimately take when you sit in those rooms. I don't even know what they
And
do
they're just
now, but
and they're just
pre-COVID, it was
bound.
like you go into
They're
a
just
school and you take this city service test, and then you wait 3 years to hear back on how you did, and if you get called back, and it's just insane.
even the exams that have practice material. You can go to the city store, um, or and buy one or purchase one. But like you said, they're done like at Kinko's and they're just like bound together. And I actually did that a few years back. Well, I want to say like early 2013. I went and purchased one of these study guides. And it was my first civil service exam that I was taking. And I'm like, I'm gonna really study this. I'm gonna take it serious. I'm gonna ace this exam. I studied for weeks ahead of the exam. Took notes, highlighted key important facts. Got to the exam. Not one question from the study guide was on this exam,
Mhm.
and that was demoralizing because also I just spent money for this guide as well. It wasn't cheap. It was like $120 for this little
Wow.
guide of like I want to say 60 or 70 pages. And then to find out that on top of that, I paid the 65 or $80 to take the exam and none of the questions were in there. A lot of it was just it was basic, math questions and,
Yeah.
just basic questions that had nothing to do with the exam. I was like, this is really a waste. And then to figure out that pretty much all the exams were like that, except for some that are really specialized, but the
Yeah.
overall majority of them are the same way.
Yeah.
And it begs the question, is like, do we actually need this then?
Yep.
And
And I
they're like
think,
high
go ahead.
stress too, right? Like they're like
Yeah.
high stress environments. I remember I could like the largest question that everybody had when I went to go take mine was like, can we bring a calculator? Like it was like you hyper focus on the most like inconsequential part of it, but it is high stress because it's like, no, you need this exam. And Anthony, you mentioned this earlier, like it's also about promotions. There's also
Yeah.
promotional like pieces to this. So you don't even know that until you get in, and then you're like, oh, I have to have taken part A, B, C to be able to go to the next salary band or the next union title. And I think that is the other piece where there is no, not only like actually taking the exam, but then what happens after? How do I even have
Hmm.
progression if I want to maybe do something different? What does that even look
Yeah.
like? And there isn't any way
Absolutely.
to get that information.
Absolutely. One thing that I sort of was, so some of the things that they outlined in the report is these are some of the recommendations that they made: to designate a chief recruitment officer, to identify offices with the greatest staffing needs, to provide recruitment support and reduce barriers for hard to recruit positions, marketing the city's mission-driven workplace, and offering incentives for joining government. And all those things I think are great, but it's also like, how is this going to play out with city government, right? Because you have the bureaucracy. So my things
Mhm.
are, yes, I agree, because it shouldn't be that because you work for the city, you're not entitled for getting nice things. You're not worth being recruited for what could arguably be seen, right, as really urgent and important work. So that's definitely like, I guess, somewhat of like a mindset shift that the city has to make, but it's sort of like overcoming barriers. So all of us have worked in operations, and like the first, oh, we as a city, we can't do that. How would we issue payments to people because the policies don't allow them for that? And then the policies, how long are those going to take to revise? Like it just seems like a never ending sort of like, no, we can't do that. Because one of the things that I wanted to mention, and I sort of caught wind of this, and it's like such a thing that I used to get frustrated with even when I was still working in the city, and it's still happening despite being called out in the staffing crisis, is the limitation to internal candidates only. So for a very long time, you'd have job postings that would go up and you were like very excited because you could post your job, but would only be limited to people within the agency and maybe with an exception within city government. And so then that further exacerbates the problem. And I think that's again to sort of like say, yes, we're filling, to your point, Anthony, the key positions, but we're only going to post it internally. But then the problem that creates is, okay, this team gets someone, but then you left the hole someplace else. So essentially, you're like was it borrowing from Peter to pay Paul? You're not addressing it. You're just moving the problem, right? And so for so long, not only has it been we're not filling vacancies, but then the vacancies we are filling are ones with internal people that only makes the problem worse, because you're continuing what I see is like cannibalizing your agency, because you're eating away at your own people and not bringing in others externally. So that to me is like a big challenge that's not captured here. It's like you need, okay, you're posting positions, which they say they are, but again, a lot of them are internal postings. So you're still not addressing the issue, because you're still going to have the same numbers of vacancies, because you're not really bringing in any external people. You're just moving around internal people. So I'm curious, like what other things are you seeing as like challenges? Like it's all great in terms of plan. Like, yes, we should have this. Anthony, you mentioned like, okay, we have a recruitment officer, but who is this person going to report to? Like, I couldn't agree with you more. I think my personal experience has been, yes, this was a national issue, but a lot of it is also promulgated by the administration's perception on the value of having people and retaining good people. So how can that leader or those leaders who sort of were okay with this exodus of employees now be allowed to be tasked with a recruitment strategy and a retention strategy? Like, I don't necessarily trust that. So I do think that both a recruitment officer and a retention officer and someone to just really assess the system, right, from soup to nuts, is really important, because yes, we've had those systems, we've had them for a reason. Civil service was to get away from nepotism, and that's totally understandable. But you can't tell me that people didn't figure out ways to bring in people that they knew or people that they liked. There's always ways to get around it. So if it didn't really address that issue, why are we still married to the system? And it's now getting in the way of staffing up these positions that we need to like keep the city running. So my thing is, between recruitment and retention, it's like, what have, lots of key points here. They're all valid, great ideas, but like, what are some of the challenges or things that the city you think really needs to prioritize, or things that you've seen that are not captured here based on your experiences?
No, I think that definitely the point that you brought on about the civil service exams, being a target for nepotism. I mean, we've seen it, Liz and Sahara. I'm sure you saw it as well. There's ways to get around it. t- I've seen it tons of times in various different agencies. So it's not just unique to one different agency. There are ways to get around that, especially the higher up the food chain that you go, when you can make special appointments or special advisors. Those are just ways of getting around this system. So the system really is penalizing the everyday person, from obtaining positions that they normally would be able to get because they're qualified for them. It's just blocking them out completely. While there's a small segment that could still benefit from the connections they have. There is the perception that city government and working at a city agency, a lot of it is about the connections, and that is in some aspects very true when it comes to getting appointed to positions, promotions. Um, yeah, I've been seeing it now, as I mentioned earlier. There's positions that we think that are valuable positions, but uh, they're getting rejected from on high, because they don't necessarily see the value in that position. But then there's positions that leadership sees as valuable, and they make it happen. Right? They move heaven and earth to make that happen. Same thing with promotions and getting certain employees more money. If you're in the in crowd or you're one of the favorites, or you're well connected, they'll make that happen for you. Whereas for everyone else, you either don't get it or you really have to scratch and claw to do so. Um, for me, it's the civil service thing. I think, um, as you mentioned, Liz, we're posting positions. Most of them could be internal, recruits only or other city agencies. And you brought up the good point. You're cannibalizing either your own agency or another agency. And then again, you're blocking out a segment. And then on the flip side, we're also posting positions that require a civil service exam. So now we know we've lost, as the report said, over 20,000 folks that maybe have civil service exams. They're not more than likely coming back. There's a large segment of the population that we could bring on or that could apply, but they don't have civil service exams or titles and don't know what that is to begin with. So we're blocking them out. So I think some of it is lip service to say, hey, we're still posting, we're trying to recruit, but it's just not happening. So that later on they can come back and say, you weren't able to fill that position, we're going to need that vacancy. We're going to take that money from you.
Mhm.
And then that causes further stress on the people that are still there trying to do that work. Now, I think if you're an engineer for the city or an attorney or something that's highly specialized, I think that having a civil service exam or some type of entry exam, has merit,
Yeah.
because you do want to know that this person, if
Like
they're
core
an engineer,
competencies.
exactly.
Yeah.
If they're an engineer and they're going to work for DOT and they're going to be working on roads, you want to know that they know what they're supposed to be working on. But some of the other things, that's operational work, administrative work, if you went to college or you have some type of specialized certificate or degree, kind of speaks to that. And that's what the interview process and the vetting process should be for.
Mhm.
Um, so I think that's a big issue that the city really needs to tackle, which the report does mention as one of the key aspects for recruitment. Um, yeah, so
Yeah.
I think that's one of the big issues.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think I can chime in because what Anthony said, I think resonated with me too, is like I think definitely the civil service piece, but I think in addition to that, like where are these critical vacancies, right? Like I think how are you defining that as a critical vacancy? I think that's really helpful um context for both the hiring managers, but also the people that are like trying to support and share postings with their networks or something, right? Like
Mhm.
how have you determined that?
Yeah.
And how have you looked across city agencies and this goes back to what you said, Liz, like how have you looked across city agencies to really understand what is the work that's being done and where has the gaps occurred? Like I think I think the report does a great job in continuing this conversation and giving ideas, but I think we need to also see like what does this look like at scale, right? Like
Mhm.
where is at scale the issues popping up? And they mentioned certain agencies, and we mentioned some of the implications in terms of service, but who are the people that were doing the work? Who are the people that were making the decisions? Like that hierarchy of roles matters when you think about what
Mhm.
is a critical vacancy. And we have a lot, not to get into popular press, but we have a lot of press around Adams and the administration and what roles that he's hired for, and where nepotism may or may not have had a stake. And I think that's like a whole nother podcast, but like
Sure.
I think that is that's what that's the environment that we're in. If we're
Sure.
recognizing what is a critical vacancy, that will help us strategize on how to fill that vacancy, and what is the best way to do it.
Yeah.
And then I think another thing that we talked a little bit about is like communication and transparency. Like, the report talks about better marketing and, it talks about a case study about, being like show your love for your city, something like that, right? Like, I think that works well, but what are the citizens of New York City going through right now, right? Like what is their experiences? We talked about inflation, we talked about like not being able to find good healthcare or providers, or is MTA going to raise the fares again? Like this is what the citizens are going through. So
Yep.
how are you marketing to them? How are you
Yeah.
communicating to them? And those are the people that are going to come back and support. And there's definitely, like, it's not like doom and gloom, right? There are people that still want to support the city. There's people like you mentioned, Liz, like your dad, that are like, this is a space where I can see myself growing and thriving and contributing. And there is young talent that is committed to that and wants to be part of that, but you have to be able to be transparent and communicate exactly how they can be a part of that. And I don't think it's enough to say even if we get by some miracle the civil service thing on lock, like I don't think it's enough to say, okay, take this exam and then we'll call you in 5 years. Like you need to have a lot more sense of communication and of what this can do for them. And I think those are the two spaces that I think really is a great place to start.
Mhm.
But it isn't going to be a problem that I think is going to be solved in a year. Like it
Yeah.
isn't something that you're not going to solve the staffing crisis with one solution in 1 year. Like it's not. We need like short-term wins and then long-term goals.
Yep, absolutely. And that's sort of like a nice segue to this retention aspect, which we again talked about, like sort of things that we think are sort of crucial to retaining and attracting and retaining key people. But the report calls for designating a chief retention officer, facilitating annual reviews and exit interviews, proactively tracking and addressing staffing trends and performance, and building morale and cultivating a mission-driven culture. And these are things I think, again, like a chief retention officer, same for recruitment. I think the city as a whole, to your point, needs to have some strategy on how it's managing its people and how to, right, like build up its workforce. Like I mentioned this, I don't even know what the totals are now, but the city's workforce at its peak pre-COVID was about 400,000 people, right? This across all agencies. Think about all the teachers, all the officers, firefighters, all the inspectors you see, right? Parks workers, like the list goes on and on. So it's massive, and there should be some intentional, somewhat like direction behind managing that workforce. That absolutely should be a priority. And like, how do you retain those people and how do you manage those people? Because you are going to have some apples that are
Mm-hmm.
not great for the roots you're
Yeah.
trying to sort of like, you know, germinate and like, get well rooted and supported into this larger issue. And like, how do you address those things as well? Like there's lots of this, so we could talk about that. But I wanted to sort of talk about your experiences with annual reviews and exit interviews, which Sahara you started talking about. Now, my last agency did not do formal annual reviews. My first agency did. Now, my experience with reviews was you did it because the agency did them every year, but it was not attached to anything. And it was an interesting conversation that I had with another colleague over the years about like, okay, yeah, we could review people, but like, what does that do? And what's the outcome? And my experience when getting reviewed annual is like, oh, you're great. There's like a scale of 1 to 4, but I can't give you a 4 because there's always room for you to grow. And I could be getting, doing like really well and going and exceeding, going above and beyond, but there's nothing you can do. There's like no clear direction on like what my next steps were. And I feel like prior to the administration change, those were things that we were trying, at least as a department, to try and outline. Like we shouldn't just be moving people because they're yes people or because they're people that we like. We should be moving people who can get things done and have demonstrated, or like at least give people pathways to understanding what their development looks like. So yes, you should have means for interviews, but the reality is in city government, it doesn't lead to anything. It can just turn into a place for you to like dump on me things that you didn't talk to me about all year. And then we walk away feeling resentful. There's like no real outcome from those conversations for those agencies that do them. So yes, it's good to do evaluations, but like what do they lead to? And for exit interviews, same thing. And I just want to make one note too, because they mentioned 360 interviews. I used to be so, this is like a throwback word, verklempt, if you guys remember that from like back in the days. I used to get verklempt because I would get evaluated, but I couldn't evaluate my managers. I couldn't
Mhm.
evaluate up. You only got evaluated down. And I never quite knew if the people above me were having those conversations or if they were exempt from those conversations. But I had issues with certain managers and how departments
Yeah.
were being run or teams were being run. And that feedback was like not necessarily welcomed all the time. And it wasn't my place to manage up, right? So if we're talking about real 360, it needs to go in all 360 directions. It's not just you evaluating me. It's like, if you are, then what's that attached to? And then what kind of feedback is being given to all the people in the organization, right? I think that needs to be like a broader scale picture. So that's just like one thing that's just like, ooh, it gets me riled up when we talk about evaluations. Oh my gosh. And then exit interviews, yeah, like you need to do them. Good organizations do them, but what are you going to do with that? If you have an administration that has no interest in knowing about you, it doesn't care if you leave, what's going to happen with that information, right? So I do think it's important when you have someone steering organizations that really pays attention to that feedback. But if you don't have buy-in from the leadership or the leadership of agencies, or to your point, like people a couple layers down don't have the authority to act on it, it's pointless, right? So that was just like, ooh, those are areas where I get riled up just because you experienced it. And you're like, oh my God, like, yes, we need that. But city government, or at least like what I've seen, is there's no way. So just
It's
curious.
slow to, I mean, city government, as we're seeing with everything, it's slow to change, right? Just as it's slow to change with the dynamic of the workforce and the expectations, it's slow to change on a micro level, right? Agency
Mhm.
to agency. I mean, you can implement, they're slow to change with implementing broad policies in general in terms of what the work looks like. So whether it be 360 reviews or exit interviews, that's taken a while. Obviously, that this report highlights that as a citywide initiative or something that should be implemented citywide. But then it takes even longer at the agency level, because even though you can get it from City Hall and it's something that's implemented, it takes a while to sort of start trickling down, because they get a grace period. We've seen initiatives that come from City Hall, and it's like, well, you have 2 years to roll it out, and some agencies are quicker to do it than others. Some do it half-heartedly or somewhat performative when they're doing it. And that is one of the negative things of working in city government, is that the way that things are done are very much entrenched in the minds of management, but also just the workers. And each agency operates in the way that they've normally always operated for to a large extent. And changing that thought process and breaking those habitual things is going to be very difficult.
Yeah.
And while I love the idea of a 360 review, um, I think it's going to be a difficult task, because we've touched on it a bit here. There could be the issue of reprisals or being blackballed or blacklisted if you're too honest with your supervisor or your manager. And then even you as a manager, if you're a manager and you're reporting up and maybe sharing some of the concerns that your staff are bringing to you to your leadership, that can cause a rift between you and your leadership, of how your team is viewed. There could also be a issue with having some resentment towards your staff. I think it has to be very tastefully handled
Yeah.
in
That's a
the
good point.
approach, and there has to be earnest buy-in in it. I mean, Liz, you mentioned the agency that you worked at. I experienced that as well, and it was a 1 to 4. It was very performative. There was nothing attached to it. For the most part, you never really sensed you were going to lose your job, but you never also sensed that there was a path to growth if they did highlight something, or a path to say, hey, you're doing an amazing job. We're thinking of you for this new position, or maybe more money, or here's how you could improve to get to this position. And then uh, it was kind of like Liz mentioned, there was just an opportunity for them to dump on you, and maybe you to sort of air your grievances. It felt like like Festivus, right? Like you were just we're just all airing our grievances. But then the current agency where I'm at, we don't do that. That's not it's not a codified thing. We're starting to do something like that. And right now it's in the initial phases, but even what that looks like is still being built out, and sort of what the implications of it are still being developed. And to some extent, I do appreciate that it's being developed. There's a lot of staff buy-in to it and a lot of feedback. But that's just my agency doing it. That doesn't mean that
Right.
another agency is doing it. So our experiences as city employees is varying from agency to agency. But I did have concerns with the 360 review. We know that, as I mentioned, city government, for lack of a better term, there's cliques, right?
Yeah.
You're in the in crowd, you're in the out crowd, you're either well connected or you're not. And for the most part, people pick up on, hey, I want to just do my work, sort of stay under the radar. And things like this could lead to you either being in the in crowd because you're being very flattering to the person you're reviewing in the hopes of career advancement, or if you're being brutally honest, it can put you sort of in that out crowd where now you're just stuck and mired in this job, and now you're wondering, why am I not growing in this field?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think like the number one thing, and I think you hit it on the head, Anthony, is like you need to have trust. Like you cannot do 360, you cannot do exit, you cannot do even recruitment, I think, without trust. And like that space, like, if they, they mentioned, Liz, you mentioned like the chief recruitment officer, chief retention officer, like we need a chief trust officer. Like we need somebody to come in.
I like that.
And
Add it
like,
to the report.
yeah, like we need somebody to come in and actually be like, how do we foster trust, transparency, and communication? That's like basic. And I think there is amazing managers in city agencies that don't have the resources to do more professional development to get better. And then you have managers that just became managers where are their resources to get to improve and learn? Like, it's a skill set. And so
Mm-hmm.
we don't even necessarily consider how to foster that skill set. A lot of it is on the job learning, which is, you know, in many industries, but I think particularly like the private sector, there is a lot of opportunities to go and have professional development, and, you know, and in most industries it's encouraged. But what about city service, right? We're employees too. We're people that have managers and staff and, you know, deputies and senior deputies. And so how are you actually fostering that knowledge? There's no point in having a 360 or an exit interview if people don't understand what they can actually do with that. And then the other thing that like personally always gets me is, and this was, you know, Liz, you know, that like that was the work we did and my team did in our agency, was around defining terms. Like, you can't measure what you can't define. So how are you, to both of your experiences, right? Like, you're getting a 1 to 4, great, but like on what? How are they defining that, and how does that show up in the
Right.
workplace? And I think that that clarity is the first step. Otherwise, you run risk of doing actual harm, and particularly for diverse communities, because you're already thinking that you have to do twice as much work to be
Oof.
in a space where somebody who is not
Absolutely.
part of the
Yes,
diverse
indeed.
community is. And then you get this feedback that is maybe performative, maybe it's just like, well, no, you can't get a 4 because there's always room to growth. You're going to take it twice as hard. And how does that show up in the work you do? So I think for retention, for sure, but to Anthony's early point, like, you have a new hire that just joined and now they're getting this 360. What does that do for them? Right? Like, how does that help them stay or not stay? I think those are the spaces we need to really
Yeah.
think about and take a step back to then, like, 2 steps back to make 1 step forward, because you know, you need to really focus on trust first.
I love that.
I want to jump in. I think, Sahara, you mentioned earlier, you know, there's a story with data, and I think we could use 360 reviews and all these tools to get a picture of the sentiment of staff and even managers. But it's really, you know, having the desire to do so. And then also what you do with that data, because the data is only as good as what you do with it. We can do all of
Absolutely.
these reviews and it could sit there and leadership could do nothing with it. Or, you know, in a more nefarious way, they can use it to sort of tell their narrative, right? So that's
Yeah.
always been my concern with just being too data driven in some aspects. I think, you know, when it comes to this work, there is a lot to be said about the qualitative aspects of how you engage with staff. Um, my personal experience for me is I, I think your management style, or when you do become a leader, if you have the opportunity to be in a leadership position, is it's very much informed by your past experiences with other managers.
Oh yeah.
And I think, Sahara, you mentioned that's where's the support for these managers? Because you know, they may be well intentioned, but their past experiences with other managers is that, hey, this is how we do things. And that's
Yeah.
across the board in the private sector as well. But if you support them on like, hey, this is the mission of our agency or the city as a whole, and our management style needs to align with this, and providing those supports to do that. And that's why I think the retention officer, along with the recruitment officer, needs to be decoupled from City Hall, because, again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're having them be appointed by the mayor, who's to say, you know, when the
Yeah.
next mayor comes in, they're going to replace this individual with someone that aligns more closely with what their view of retention and recruitment is. And it should be someone that's appointed by a panel. And there should be changeover in these positions. But then I also think there needs to be agency level people that
Mhm.
report back up to this individual, or maybe team of individuals, so that the focus on culture and mission driven work and aligning that together can stay somewhat consistent even as the mayors change.
Mhm.
So and for me personally, I was informed by my previous managers, but in a good way, I think, because I always told myself when I first became a manager of a team is it was nerve-wracking because there weren't those resources there to help me prepare. A lot of it was talking to colleagues that have been doing this for a while, sort of doing some research on my own. But my North Star, as you mentioned, Sahara, was for me is all of the things that my previous managers did that frustrated me. I always vowed to myself, if I was in a position where I was conflicted, I would do the complete opposite of what they did with me. And I think
Yeah.
that can serve a lot of managers well, if especially new managers, if you're ever in a position where you're unsure of what to do, is what are the things that when I was an employee that really bothered me that never were addressed either by my direct supervisor or by, leadership. And that's not to say that you can change everything if you're supervising a team, but there are things you can control. And the
Yep.
things that you can control, I think you should address them and then try to sort of support your team by shielding them from some of the nastier aspects, but still sharing. I'm big on sharing with my team, maybe a little too much. We do. So I think we do 360s on an ongoing basis because my approach is to let them know, as you mentioned, Sahara, they're adults. If there's issues going on, we all know that the city's in a fiscal crisis or coming to a fiscal cliff, which is part of the reason they're trying to address the staffing shortages and some of these other things. And I tell my team, hey, here's the situation, here's where we are, so that if something does happen, they're not surprised, but I like to get their feedback as well. And I
Mhm.
think that that makes you a better supervisor, but also moves the work forward better in a more holistic way. And
Yep.
sorry for rambling on
Totally.
there a bit.
No, it's
No.
fine. Listen, so I just want to say, first of all, my soul is like so full because this is why we do this. You guys are just incredible. I just want to say, like, incredible. I'm always
You're
blown
incredible,
away
Liz.
by
You're
the
incredible.
amazing things
You
that
are.
come out of your brains and your experiences and how you approach your work. So I just want to say that first. Second, I want to say we said this was going to be an hour conversation. We are running up on 2. And how much longer could we go on though, right? Like how fast did that go? And
Yeah.
Yeah.
there's so many people who are experiencing this right now who have gone through it. And so I'm eternally grateful for you sharing your experiences and being on. And I hope that others find this conversation as enriching and, share their experiences, more widely with others because this could be really a much longer conversation. We could keep going on, and we will have more conversations, right? Because this is so multifaceted. It's about employee management. It's about civil service. It's about, how we perceive city employees and city government. And there's so many more conversations we're going to have. There's one last point in the report, which is modernizing government. And I'll be very brief about that because I feel like we've spoken about it. But it's this concept of trying to address, right, like how the workforce has changed, how the city can maybe modernize in that way with its people management. But I know we spoke about that point earlier of like there's lots behind that. My frustration has been, a lot of these sort of shifts have been based on the people. And I think a bias in a sense that we don't care or we're part of the problem. But there's lots of systems and lots of bureaucracy and lots of issues that exist in the systems themselves that have not been addressed. So if we're talking about modernizing government, we have to zoom out and look at a lot of different systems. Like if you're going to have less people, it might be possible, but are you looking at the systems that these people work in? I, as a parent, as an example, for special education, filled out the same form for my son with my name, his date of birth, my address. I don't know how many times, handwritten. It's probably not legible by most people. Or if you don't even speak English, who is transcribing and converting, right? And translating that for the people entering this stuff. Like we have so many ways that we can streamline experiences for people, but we don't talk about that. Like we need to modernize government in a very different way. Again, a much larger conversation. But I just wanted to sort of put that out there as like food for thought for people when thinking about modernizing government. It's not just about the systems and addressing the staffing crisis, but how can we fix the systems that the staff work in every day? But as a closing point, I, wanted to say that your stories with the 2 of you are like magnified. If ever were a point that I could make, it's that there are a lot of people in city government that are truly incredible, incredibly smart, have lots of unique experiences that they bring to the table and just have a lot of passion, right? For their colleagues, for the work that they do and to do a good job. And so like if you see these conversations we've had so far, there's a lot more to them, right? And also for those, I feel like that you might question their integrity or their dedication. There's a lot of stuff that we're exposed to in our years in city government. So there might be a reason why people are the way that they are. And we got to look at that too. So I want to ask you both, with all that's been happening and all that's happened, what is something that you want people to know about the city's workforce and sort of like a hope you might have for its future? I sort of want to end with that point. Anthony, Sahara, go ahead. You were muted.
Okay. Yeah, I was gonna jump in.
Yes.
I love that. I love your framing of that, Liz. I think I think I'll answer the first part first. Like I definitely think that one of the things that I loved about working in the city was the work was really fulfilling. And the people that people always say like the people that I work with keep you going, but it was really that, right? Like I think we were a well-oiled machine running really well and providing services that were very, very critical. And I love that. I love being able to like bring that to that space, be creative, be innovative, like even within the confines of a bureaucracy. Like I myself was very skeptical coming into city government because I was like, no, because I came from nonprofits and I was like, no, I know the work. Like I've seen it like at the grassroots. And I was skeptical because I was like, I don't know if I'll be able to have an impact like that in city government. But I really leaned into it and I saw not only can you have that impact, but it can be at scale. And that's really what like inspired me every day. And I think, I hope for the future of city government that we can be more reflective of like how we're showing up and how our systems are showing up, so that we can continue to do that impactful work. Because for all that we try to accomplish, those day-to-day impacts, those day-to-day services that we provide, that smile on a child's face, that like peace of mind for a person that is trying to get services, like that is huge. That is huge. So my hope is we can be reflective so we can really address some of these issues and not have them be so hypothetical or so abstract that it's going to take 15 years, because we don't have that, right? Like the pandemic impacted everybody in huge ways. It should also impact city service. Like we should really take a beat and think about how we can do better.
Love it.
Thank you, Sahara. That was, well said. I think one thing I like to share and regarding city government and on just city employees overall, I think that they're very resilient. If the pandemic has shown us anything, and the time period since the pandemic, is that city employees are resilient, and they are the heartbeat of this city, to a large extent. And I think I'm hopeful that this report, although I was skeptical of it at first, just because of the institute that it was coming from, and they're very much tied to this administration. So on initial read, I'm thinking like it's going to mirror a lot of what the administration wants it to look like, or what their thoughts were initially. But I was pleasantly surprised to see that a lot of the recommendations that they made, although higher level with not a lot of like concrete examples of how to roll it out, aligned with a lot of the feelings that we're sharing here today. And this could be one of the benefits, that if this is an institute that is closely aligned with the mayor's office, the hope is that the mayor's office is going to highly consider this and implement some of these things. As you mentioned, hybrid work. I know this can be its own podcast, but I strongly believe that this is something that the city needs to shift to on large scale. And it not only will it improve the morale and reduce the attrition rate, as the report mentioned, it will help give back to the city in an economic sense, because if individuals are able to spend less on commuting and spend less on the costs that are attributed with having to be in a workplace, you're more likely to then go and buy something from your local store, or spend more money just maybe taking the trains to go see a play or something like that. And I think that's something that I'm hopeful that they're really considering, and it sounds like they are, based on the tentative agreement they have with DC 37. And I'm hopeful to see what that looks like for the rest of the unions. But I also think there's a smart way to be fair for our colleagues that don't have that option as well. And briefly, I think one of the things that was highlighted in there is maybe a bonus system for those individuals that can't do that. But I won't ramble on about that. I just want to really highlight that I think the city workforce is resilient. I think if you, as we mentioned, if you treat them with respect, you give them pathways to grow, really value their knowledge and their lived experiences, some of these problems could be remedied. And just taking this report and taking the experiences that we've been through and not allowing the next fiscal disaster or the next issue to bubble up, because we can see them coming. It's just a matter of addressing them. Let's not wait till they become big
Sure.
issues that are in the public eye. If we're seeing them, let's address them early on so that they don't become, a 40 or 45 page report, because we've addressed them early on. So that's my hope for the current administration and the future administrations, is that we're being proactive instead of reactive, and really future planning and thinking forward. And I think that's one thing that hopefully city government and the public sector mimics from the private sector.
Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, it's like, I love that idea of like trust and buy-in. Like people are resilient, and people for the most part really care to do a good job and to feel like they're having that impact and that they're valued. And so you have to trust people to be, to take the ride with you
Yeah.
and to have your back. Like, I feel like if you have good trust as a leader, when times get tough, people will have your back. But if you don't, it's like you're not going to have that loyalty that you need to get through those tough times. And I feel like it is true. We're like really at a tough spot. So hopefully we can regain that sort of camaraderie and yeah, we saw
And
it in certain
briefly,
periods in rough times, right? Like in when 9/11 happened, like the city, people beyond other agencies were coming in to help in. Like, you all rally, you all support each other during the hurricanes. Like, we do pull together, but you have to have those leaders that inspire you to have that sense of loyalty, not only, not even to them, but to the city and to their colleagues and everyone else. So it's such a really incredible point.
and briefly, it is rewarding work, right? I think you do see it in the interactions with your colleagues. As Sahara mentioned, that's usually what
Yep.
keeps you in the workplace, aside from the values, the core values that brought you to the work to begin with. It is seeing it. And even for me, there's times where I don't necessarily initially see the impact that it's having on our citizens, or the families that we serve. But then there's times where I'm just, walking around, and it's like, hey, like, that's a result of the work that we've been doing. So it is rewarding in seeing that. And there are some aspects that you immediately see, but it's also thinking about like those long-term rewards and impacts on our communities, and especially for social services. And I think that's where you want to have the long-term goal, because we don't always necessarily see it immediately. And I know we're a culture, especially with TikTok and everything, that really wants that instant gratification of like, hey, I did this in my job, and this is the immediate result of this. And we usually tend to skew policy that way. But I think uh, having that horizon of 5-10 years out in a lot of aspects is a good thing to have, because you're going to see the fruits of that pay off. And just to bring it back, full circle, is, as you mentioned, you're living proof from your dad having this job of that was stable, and allowed him to do overtime and have some extra money. You were able to maybe be afforded some of the things that other people maybe weren't able to be afforded. And I think those are sort of the long-term effects of the work and the services that we provide. And it's thinking about the future generation, and how it's impacting them, and the positive impact it'll have.
Absolutely. I love it. Oh, so much from there. So I'm like taking notes. I'm sitting here. I'm like, these
Let's
are more
do
conversations we
let's
have
do
to have.
another
Oh my
let's
gosh.
do a part 2.
Oh yeah, for sure. There's so many like just valuable nuggets of information. So definitely want to sort of continue the conversation. So again, I just want to thank you both. I want to say, folks we've had on come on the weekends. It's a Saturday, a cold and wet one, but still a Saturday, and your time off. You took a couple hours to sit with me and talk about this. And I know this just really speaks again to people's passion and their belief in what they're doing and for their colleagues and this sector. And so again, I'm just like eternally grateful to you both and appreciate you, and so many others who do just like really it is rewarding and impactful work. And I would just hope that the systems get out of the way and allow people to continue to do the impactful and rewarding work that needs to happen. And so the conversation will definitely continue. But Anthony, my friend, Sahara, my friend, I definitely want to thank you again for being on, because this was just an incredible conversation, as I knew it would be. And so looking forward to having more in the future. So thank you both again. This was just awesome.
And thank you, Liz, and thank you for giving a voice to the people working in city government. And congratulations on the podcast. You're doing an amazing job.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
we love it. Thanks for giving
Yes.
space.
Of
It's
course,
really
of course.
nice.
Of course. We're going to keep them going. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
All right, so I know that was a bit of a doozy and longer than our normally scheduled programming, but man, that was just a conversation that I could not stop. Honestly, the time flew by while we were in it, and even listening to a playback went so fast because, I think this conversation is super relatable to people who have worked in New York City government over the years and touches on issues that have sort of existed for a long time, but just have sort of blown up in more recent history with things that have happened during the transition and in dealing with the post-COVID work world. And so I hope you found this conversation to be as enjoyable, relatable, and enlightening, enriching, or affirming to your experience or others that you've heard. If you didn't know, now you know what's been happening, and I hope we really try to advocate for us as a city to approach things differently, because clearly what we've been doing over time wasn't working, and getting an external factor drawn into the mix kind of forced us to see that a broken system can have consequences if we're not being proactive, forward-thinking, or strategic. And a lot of good nuggets came from this conversation, and I'm always in awe of the wisdom among colleagues and peers, again, and just the practicality in our shared and lived experiences. And, we know what needs to happen. People have the passion, and they really want to make change if we can trust people to come forward and to create those spaces for people to come forward with those ideas and with those challenges in order, again, for us to chart a better way forward with people across all levels of organizations, especially, here in city government. So while it was a long conversation, I can tell you we could have gone on and on. And this is something, that people are really passionate about. It's affecting people not only on the service receiving end, but also those who are working in city government. It's affecting people's well-being, their day-to-day work, their home lives, right? Like if you're stressed, that goes home, and that can affect people's families. It can affect their health. And we really want to try to advocate for things to get better, because the state of affairs right now is just not sustainable. And it's affecting the people within the system and those beyond. So there's a lot more to unpack from this conversation. I definitely took some notes, and we'll continue to have more in-depth convos about things like promotional opportunities and investing in the public sector, talking about the civil service system, revisiting the impacts and best practices for transitions within administrations, and trying to reflect what consequences we're having with this redirection and redefining of agendas, and how it can be detrimental for us to be constantly changing course and direction of the city. And in this case, we talked about not really having a clear direction. And so we need to continue with that conversation, and again, to advocate for those things to be improved. As always, I love and look forward to hearing from people. If you enjoyed this conversation, if it resonated with you, I'd love to hear about your experience. The more that we can amplify these stories and these ideas, the better off I think our city will be. And so I'm happy to connect with people across all service areas. So feel free to reach out to me or to put me in touch with others. You can reach me via email at liz@civilconversationsnyc.com. I also created a Padlet for this conversation, which allows you to share some feedback anonymously. I know it's not easy to put yourself out there, to put yourself on the line, and I totally understand it. And that's a realness that people have to acknowledge when there's not trust, that you can say things even when they're sort of substantive and rooted in experience and good intent. And so I hope this creates some space to share more ideas and feedback. And if it goes well, we can create more to create that space for other conversations. And as always, I hope this continues to grow and to reach more colleagues and people impacted by the cause. And I thank you for listening in, and please stay in touch. Please share this with others, and let's keep the conversation going.